Well, Judson, today in chapel we are talking about sex.
Come on, let's talk about sex, baby.
You know the
Let's
words.
talk about you and me.
Come on, you know the words.
Let's talk about all the good things and the bad things that make
There we are.
Let's talk about
There we
sex.
are, yeah.
Let's talk about sex.
Okay,
Let's talk about sex.
you're gonna get carried away. You're gonna get carried away. You're gonna get carried away. Chili's has had a special place in my sexual journey. It's a weird opener, isn't it? I had 3 people look over this message, and they all thought that was funny. No, Chili's has a special place in my sexual journey. You see, in 3rd grade, my parents came to me and they said, "Chris, we have something important to talk with you about. Where do you want to go eat dinner?" And my dumb 3rd grade brain said, "Let's go to Chili's. Bottomless chips and salsa. Their shakes are pretty good. Let's do that." And so we went to Chili's, and my parents busted out a book and then proceeded for the next 2 hours to talk to me about sex, which must have been very awkward for the man and woman that was seated right next to us. And I recall at one point in the conversation turning to my dad in just absolute bewilderment that this was a thing and going, "You do this? How often?" And my dad, knowing that whatever his response would be, I would probably remember the rest of my life, was like, "I don't think you want to know that," and just kind of moved on. My sexual journey continued. In 5th grade, we had the talk in my public high school with bananas and everything. But in 6th grade, I would say I did not experience my sexual awakening until 6th grade, because it wasn't until I was in a computer lab for some kind of a class project that the guy next to me encouraged me to type a website that was very similar to the type of research that we were doing for some sixth grade class. And that was my first introduction into pornography. That was my first introduction, and when I first saw it, I was sitting there going, "Oh, this is interesting. I think I like this. I'm not quite sure what to make of it. I'm not sure why I like it, but I do." But I felt in that moment like somehow this isn't right, because everybody here is clothed, but she's not, and so maybe we should shut this thing down. And it wasn't until a little while later that when I was babysitting my 2 brothers, when my parents had gone and my brothers went to bed, I remember logging onto our family computer, and that started well over a decade-long addiction to pornography, where it would be multiple times a week in varying seasons, where sometimes it would be incredibly frequent, and sometimes I'd have long spaces where it wouldn't affect me so much. But no matter what happened, when I felt sad, angry, alone, or depressed, my brain since 6th grade has been hardwired to go to pornography. Pornography has been my most significant sex education class. When I got this job, one of my very first pastoral counseling sessions, I was only here about a couple weeks, and one of the student leaders at the time that I hadn't met yet reached out to me and said, "Hey, can we get together and talk?" And I said, "I would love to. That's like what I'm supposed to do, I think." And so we got together over breakfast, and this student indicated that this is a conversation that had to happen immediately. And because I wasn't quite sure what I said, "Okay, let's meet for breakfast tomorrow." And so we sat down for breakfast, and she sat there with tears in her eyes as she could barely get out the words of what she was dealing with. And she went on to tell me a similar story as my own, that her first sexual experience came from pornography, from an unwanted pornographic moment, and that kind of catalyzed this thing in her world, and all of a sudden she kept returning to it and returning to it and returning to it. And when she emailed me that night, she said that she had experienced a relapse. After a while of freedom from this addiction, she had returned back to it. And so that dispelled many of the notions that I had in my mind as a very young pastor, that maybe I knew the stats of pornography and sexual education and all these other things that go with it, but my very first counseling session was with a woman and porn. I don't know if your story is anything like mine or hers. I don't know where you are in your sexual journey. I don't know if sex is happening very frequently for you or not frequently at all. The stats for Gen Z is that you all are having sex less and less, but the difference is like 10% or so. So it's not like it's not happening, but it's that you are having in-person sex less and less, but the rate of your sexualization is only increasing as it finds its way into literally every medium and every platform that you have. So as we jump into a discussion about sex this morning, my question is there somebody here, anybody here who has not been hurt by sex, has not had questions about sex, whether you're questioning your sexual identity or what it looks like to work itself out in a Christian context, or what does this mean? Because sex at the core is about who we are. Namely, it speaks to how we are vulnerable with others, how we receive love and affection, and it comes with all kinds of questions about baggage and connection. Sex is incredibly complicated. And I think there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to sex. There's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of confusion, and there are so many damaging messages. So many damaging messages. And I see it making its way through our community every single year. I have men and women sitting in my office sobbing because of sexual brokenness. And so I have a simple aim for our time. I would like to begin to untangle this crazy ball of yarn that is our sex and sexuality by just doing two main things. The first is to talk through how we got here, and the second is to talk through what now. How we got here and what now. Well, how we got here. We are only about 60 or so years into the sexual revolution, which was one of the most successful revolutions in human history. Namely, men and women rose up in the midst of the 60s and they threw off the shackles of passé, taboo, sexuality, and sex. And so they chose to live in liberation, is what they called it. What they chose to do was take sex out of the realm of that which is private, behind closed doors, and they sought to bring it into the public spotlight. And we are living in this post-sexual revolution age. And human history has seen nothing like this in terms of the scope, the scale, the marketing background, in terms of how often we are affected by it, how often we see these things in our media, on our personal devices, how often we talk about it, the types of language that we use, where we're using a lot of nailed, banged language. It sounds like someone's going to a construction site rather than engaging in some kind of sexual activity. And so we are reaping some of the consequences of this, but what I'd like to do is just kind of map out for us, create some kind of a mental map for us. What are some of the four main pillars of this new sexual moment that we are in? The four visions for sexuality that create our world, our ecosystem for what it means for us to talk about, engage with, think about sex in the modern era. So number one, the very first pillar of this new sexual moment is that sex Sex is play for grown-ups. Sex is play for grown-ups. And it's as simple as clear as that. Sex is casual. It's something that two consenting adults do. It's just an activity. It's a way to pass time. Essentially, it looks at sex and all of its derivations and says, it's just play. I mean, if you're into some weird stuff, that's fine. It's just play. Sex is just something that adults do. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It doesn't have to have all kinds of strings attached, because if an orgasm is just a chemical release that happens in the brain, why would we bother associating significance or meaning with it? Sex is just play for grown-ups. And there really isn't any guardrails on this. There really isn't anything. After all, the goal of the sexual revolution was to liberate us from our sexual taboos. It was to liberate us from the rules and restrictions that religion, family had put around us. And maybe the only guardrail actually is consent, but I would say that is the most basic and fundamental guardrail, and it kind of says something about what the movement has accomplished when consent is the only thing holding it back. Now, don't get me wrong, we absolutely should talk about consent, and the church should talk about consent, especially in married relationships. Especially in married relationships. But I think that's so base level. Like, there's no greater vision for this except for sex is play for adults. Number 2, sex is ecstasy. Sex is ecstasy. The second cultural vision for sex is that it's ecstasy. It's that it is the height of human experience. Nothing can top sex. There is nothing more exciting on the planet to do or experience or have. And if you aren't having sex, aren't watching other people having sex, aren't having some kind of an experience with sex, then you are missing out. Then you are significantly missing out on what it means to be fundamentally human. And here's the deal, if you at all ever get disappointed or disillusioned with sex, of which there are many, many people, if you ever get disillusioned or disappointed with sex, all you have to do is walk through the grocery aisle for your checkout lane, and you just see it's technique after technique after technique after technique after technique, because the answer that culture can give if sex is play and then sex is ecstasy is that if you are not experiencing the full heights of what sex can offer, then that means you must be doing it wrong, or you must not have enough experience, or you need to try what you should have seen here or there. Sex is play, sex is ecstasy. Number 3, sex is depersonalized. Sex is depersonalized. Our third cultural vision for sex is that it is becoming separated increasingly from the body, from person, from body. You have the personhood and you have who they are in terms of their body, what they look like. We are separating person from body. So the question that this new sexual moment is asking is, does the body actually matter when it comes to sex? Can we separate person from body and sexuality? Can we create a new paradigm where we are liberated from the need for a human body? Quite literally, this is seen in the new sexual frontier, is sex without bodies. This is seen in the UK, in that the UK this year just opened their new sex robot brothel. That's true. A sex robot brothel. And they trail France by about 2 years because typical. That was a good joke. Come on. You're nervous, but that was a good joke. Wow. I felt both like with me and patronizing at the same time. That's good. So for about 50 pounds, you can spend an hour with a lifelike male or female sex robot that is fully equipped with facial animation, sensors everywhere, pubic hair, choice nationality, and will even talk back to imitate the experience of a human partner. For real. The sex robot Harmony, the robot titled Harmony, that's its name, has been getting the most attention. as this is the first one to integrate artificial intelligence into the robot itself. The robot says phrases like, "I don't want anything but you. My primary objective is to be a good partner and give you pleasure. I want to become the girl you always dream of." And creators of sex robots believe that they will not only be used for stationary sex or sex in brothels, but that they will be used to carry out a host of duties around the home so that your robot will never leave you wanting for anything. It's where we create a virtual relationship without any of the constraints of a human one. Most commonly, though, I would say this is seen, obviously, in porn, as we've talked about, but in sending nudes or having intimate content on your phone. It possesses the sexual parts of a person without any of the personality. You get to have the parts of her without any of the fears, intimacy, connection that goes along with it. Fourth, sex is transient. Sex is transient. Some of the seismic shifts that have occurred from the sexual revolution is that sex became detached from marriage, from male-female relationships, from safety, commitment, love, or affection. We've brought sex away from connection into other realms of reality as we swap out videos, swap out partners, as we move from DM to DM because we are liberated people now. And so we can do that, just swap things out. And so we are now living into our full sexual freedom. Or are we? In the New York Times, there was an article titled, "What's Lust Got to Do with It?" And I'll just read what the author has to say. She says that from an interview with a college woman, "Getting naked and having sex with strangers is hard," she tells me. "We portray it as fun and we pretend it's fun, but people crave intimacy, which is not easy to create in a hookup. That's why Britain just appointed a loneliness minister." The article continues, "There's a new sense in which young women feel that they are now in competition with porn, and if they don't put out, it's easy for the guy to go home, log into Pornhub, and get what he needs there," Coles says. Listen, they're sublimating their own needs to try and please a guy. Then they realize their needs are not being met at all. Now, obviously, this was done with an interview with a woman, but I've read reports from young men as well where they would say the exact same thing, just in the reverse. It's like I'm being pressured to do what I found with porn or what she saw with porn, and it makes me very uncomfortable. But I do it anyway, and I realize I'm sublimating my own needs in order to meet their own. When we're competing with unrealistic porn stars that are always available and will do exactly what we need them to do, we can't expect every sexual experience to include emotions or even at the baseline have the most baseline emotions met. It's transient because we have a buffet of options. Swipe left, swipe right. You don't get too attached either way. Sex is transient. And so those, I think, are some of the four most significant cultural markers of our present sexual moment. Sex is play, sex is ecstasy, sex is depersonalized, and sex is transient. Now, here's the thing. These things, I intentionally did not choose things from a Christian perspective. I chose to talk about them from a Christian perspective, obviously, but I chose to take what culture is saying at its word, because culture would look at these four things and say, yes, this is what sexual liberation is. And oftentimes, these four things are touted as moral and sexual progress. And anybody who stands against this, anybody who offers a counter narrative, is often labeled as bigoted, intolerant, sexually prude or scared, or all of a sudden just not keeping up with the times. They're not on the cutting edge of sexuality. Look, is this freedom? Like, seriously, is this freedom? I don't genuinely believe it is. I don't think it's offering you nearly as much freedom as you think the next connection will bring. But here's the thing. The church, in responding to this, has done an abysmal job. The church has done an absolutely horrific job responding to the sexual revolution and the moment we are presently in. On many occasions, Christians have responded with, sex is repulsive, sex is gross, sex is dangerous. If you have had sex before marriage, then you are spent up. You are like a piece of the pie where everybody's taken some. I don't know if you heard any of that growing up, or you just don't have maybe you just don't deserve somebody. Like, you're ruining it. Oftentimes, the church has been among some of the worst traffickers in a hurtful, harmful, and dangerous theology of sex. And that isn't even to go into the fact that the church historically has not given much credence to the fact that our LGBT brothers and sisters are committing suicide at alarming rates, and we hear silence from the church. How pro-life are you? I do believe that there's a lot of fear and suspicion for what the church or scriptures might offer. I understand it. I hear it. I've sat through the services. I understand. But are we really prepared to say that our culture has figured out sex? That our culture is walking in health and freedom, walking in connection? I don't think so. And so I'd like to offer a counter narrative. I'd like to offer a counter vision of what sex could be. And when we read from the scriptures about what sex is, what it could be, and where it's headed, that the scriptures actually have some pretty incredible things to say to us. And not only that counters our present cultural moment, but could set us free in just this moment now. So we'll go through it. The first pillar of when we think of a biblical vision for what sex is that sex is good. Sex is good. At the very beginning of the Bible, we see God creating each living thing. After each new thing, God repeats with a poetic rhythm. He says, it is good. God creates water. It is good. He creates fish. It is good. He creates birds. It is good. He creates the sky. It is good. He creates male and female. He looks at that and he says, it is very, very good. This word good conveys harmony. It's often used closely with the word shalom, this eternal connection of all things, that everything is in completeness, in its fullness, that it bears God's eternal satisfaction. Now, after he gets to creating Adam, he forms Adam from the dust of the ground, and he takes Eve from Adam's very side. And get this, they are both completely naked in the garden. So God himself created both the penis and he created the vagina. And he created the clitoris, which is the only sexual organ on the human body that serves no other purpose but pleasure. He created those things. So God didn't leave for a while, come back at Adam and Eve getting it on and go, what are you doing? Stop it. Like, who was watching that? No, God actually created it, and he blessed it as good. And even more so, it says that Adam knew his wife Eve, which is a biblical euphemism for sex. And so in the beginning, at the beginning of all things, at the beginning of the garden, there is a celebration of sexuality from the very beginning. And so before anything could be corrupted, the sexual drive, arousal of both the man and the woman are celebrated. Now, I don't think we believe that God actually says that sex is good. Oftentimes we look at the scriptures, we talk about a sexual ethic from a biblical perspective, and we go like, oh, they really mean that sex is bad. From the very beginning. If you don't believe me, we're going to keep going, and we're going to read some saucy things. So, from here on out, it's going to get very interesting. God created sex. He created sexuality. He created it for procreation, for making babies, for pleasure. Yes, for pleasure. And he created it for union, for enjoying one another in the context of a commitment and bond that can carry the weight of sex. Because he didn't just give the goodness of sex and not have a container to put it in. He put it in the proper container. Sex is good. Number 2, sex is union. There's something interesting in the creation narratives of Adam and Eve, and it says, therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So here's what's interesting. In the beginning, you have oneness, nakedness, and no shame. Now, the nakedness means that, yes, they were physically naked, but it implies something deeper when we're talking about oneness and no shame. We're talking about nakedness on the physical and emotional, spiritual, psychological level. They are completely exposed, totally intimately known, without any guardrails, completely vulnerable, without any harsh responses or defensive maneuvers. No fear at all. There's no body shame. There's no body problems here. There's also no other bodies. Sex in the garden is union. It means oneness, joined together. They're naked and not ashamed. Author Deborah Hirsch, in her book, Redeeming Sex, says, this word knowing is significant because knowing does not just mean to have some abstract theoretical knowledge, but means to be intimately bound up and tied together. This word knowing is also used of our relationship with the Lord because it's meant to describe an intimate bond where we are fully known and fully loved. And so when the Bible talks about sex, it means to present it to us in its fullness, not in its emotionally truncated, stunted version. We typically think that we are far more sexualized than we should be, but in fact, I would argue we are not sexual enough. Because according to the biblical model, sexuality brings together bodies and souls. Biblical sex means to release men and women into true freedom where they can experience sex on a physical level, but also on a soul level. It's the most intimate and exposed moments and fully present. And I mean, isn't this what we all want? This is what we're all actually searching for in sex. To be accepted, not in a fleeting way, not even having to take risks, but just being able to be present as our whole, full selves. This is actually what we want. We want union. Number 3, sex is sexy. All right, so let's jump over from the beginning of all things into some steamy love poetry that Sari referenced a couple weeks ago. We're going into the Song of Solomon. This is a book of poetry that details the passionate pursuit between a lover and his wife, and it's considered a pretty scandalous book. Like little Jewish boys weren't allowed to read it until age 30, and the very first speaker we're going to encounter here is a woman. And this woman says, as an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the young men. With great delight, I sat in his shadow, and his fruit was sweet to my taste. Keep going. He brought me to the banqueting house, and his banner over me was love. Sustain me with raisins, refresh me with apples, for I am sick in love. His left hand is under my head, and his right hand embraces me. It's some steamy love poetry. Okay, so let's do some work here. Some look at this and say, okay, we're just talking figuratively, like she just loves raisins and apples. And I'm like, I don't think that means what you think it means. I think raisins and apples are a euphemism for something else. And when she is nourishing herself with the nectar of her man, it's not apples. It's something else entirely. People point to this, theologians point to this and say, this is actually a form of oral sex in the Bible. In the next chapter, the husband looks at his wife and begins to describe her beauty from head to toe, and then does a reverse a couple chapters later, and he uses a lot of agrarian imagery like wheats, goats, stones, stuff like that. Nothing that's sexy now. Like, don't just lift this out, like, hey, don't. But he describes everything, even down to her, quote, navel, which doesn't mean belly button. It's another euphemism because we're in the Songs of Solomon. And he says it's a bowl that never lacks wine. Yeah, he's not talking about her navel. He's talking about something a little farther south. And in another exchange, the man and the woman's imagery is still veiled, but not so much anymore. Like, we're getting a little more explicit. She says, let my beloved come into his garden and eat his choicest fruits. And he responds, I came to my garden, my bride. I gathered my myrrh with my spice. I ate my honeycomb with my honey. I drank my wine with my milk. Which nobody does. This is a euphemism. Wine and milk? No, okay. And later she says, it goes down smoothly for my beloved, gliding over lips and teeth. I am my beloved's, and his desire is for me. Do you still believe the Bible doesn't think we should be having sex? It gave us 8 chapters of this really steamy, erotic poetry, which barely you get behind the veil and you go like, oh, there are some crazy things happening there. One of the things I want us to notice is that the woman here is portrayed as deeply sexual without having to be caustic or become someone other than who she is. If that's not a countercultural vision to what the world is offering, I don't know what is. This clearly indicates some kind of a deeper union, some kind of a deeper intimacy. The church should not sterilize this kind of poetry. It should hold it up and say, this is actually the type of union we're talking about. The banner over me is love. There's clearly incredible passion and incredible connection joined together at the same time. Fourth, sex is formation. We got to roll. Sex is formation. Oftentimes, we like to separate what happens in the bedroom from our own transformation or formation. But in a Christian theology of sex, sex is not separated from transformation. This is just how integrated the Bible portrays sex and sexuality. Now, follow me. For centuries, Christians have believed that the ability to channel and harness our desires is an indicator of Christ's transformative process in us. And sex is not excluded from this. It's not relegated to the compulsion of, I need to, therefore I will. We submit our desires to the Lord, and as one pastor puts it, even our aroused desires, our aroused selves are submitted to the Lord. Let's put it this way. Being faithful to my wife will never be easy. Choosing to only have sex with her is never easy, and I recognize that I am always on the edge of a potential affair. Because this kind of transformative process, this kind of daily choosing of one sexual person in this transformative process, it requires the Spirit's guidance and submission to Christ. Pastor and author John Tyson summarizes it like this. He says, Christian sexuality should be the space of respect and humanity, not commodification and abuse. Sexuality, practice in the way of Jesus, leads to healing and restoration, not exploitation. And it is a place of grace and meaning in a culture of lies and deceit. He goes on, and we forget that the way the church won the Roman Empire, there were 3 of them. First, the church won the Roman Empire by how they died. They died forgiving their enemies. Second, they won the Roman Empire by being financially promiscuous. They were so radically generous that the surrounding world couldn't figure out what they were doing. Third, they were faithful in their sexuality. Tyson goes on to quote an ancient letter to Diognetus. It reads, like others, they marry and have children, but they do not expose them. They do not give them away. They care about life. They share their meals, but not their wives. And these quiet Christian practices subverted the Roman Empire over a period of 300 years. Now, here's the issue with what I just presented. Here's the issue. Sex sounds great and all. It sounds like a fantastic creation, but we live in a world that has been fractured and where we are walking around as wounded individuals. And so we bear the weight of things that have been done to us and things that we have done. And friends, this is where I believe Jesus meets us. Where the biblical vision for sex calls us to see something greater beyond ourselves and where we are in our sexual brokenness, where he meets us in our longings, mistakes, guilt, shame, and disappointments. This is where he comes alongside us and offers hope and presence. If you do a survey of the paintings of Jesus on the cross, he's often portrayed as wearing underwear, some kind of wispy clothes, like someone was like, here, take this, here's a rag. What's interesting, though, is when you look at the biblical narrative, Jesus is naked on the cross. And I don't actually blame the artist because, like, who wants to paint the penis of God? Like, that sounds terrible. You get to heaven and he's like, come on, man. But Jesus is actually naked on the cross, and I think it's a neglected theology because we don't actually portray it like that. It's a neglected theology. In Jesus' nakedness on the cross, he takes all of the shame and condemnation. He stands there humiliated, exposed, completely naked, and bearing all of the shame and condemnation of the people around him. And he begins to reverse what happened with Adam and Eve, where they felt nakedness and they were ashamed after taking of the fruit. And so he willingly subjects himself to the nakedness of the cross, and he begins to bear the weight of the shame of the world on himself. He experienced the discrediting of those around him. He experienced betrayal. He experienced feeling exposed without having any control over who could see his naked body. Listen, Jesus can take your sexual brokenness. Jesus can take your sexual brokenness, and he takes it all. And in the resurrection, he puts it in the ground. He leaves it in the tomb, and he walks out free. He took it and did away with it, never to come back again, never to have it be thrown in your face. Look, if you don't feel like a biblical vision for sex, like what I just presented, is accessible to you, then join the club. Join the club. If you don't think that your past and the things that you've done or had done to you will affect you, and you're nervous about what this could look like for the future, then join the club. If you feel your addiction, your shame controlling you, join the club. But Christ takes our sexual shame. He does away with it on the cross. And so you can freely offer it to him. Like every day, all the time. Take your sexual brokenness and give it to Jesus and see what kind of life he returns. Now, if you'll permit me, I have one aside. I have a brief aside for the many friends in here stuck in a cycle of unwanted sexual behavior and addiction. And unwanted can be anything, just anything that when you're there, you just go, I don't think this is actually what I'm looking for. The gospel offers you so much grace, so much tenderness, so much forgiveness, so much love, so much affection, so much delight and cherishing. And the song that God sings over you is not, you're an addict, you're an addict, you're an addict, you're an addict, but it's actually love. It's you are mine, and you are chosen, and you are delighted in. Jesus already took the shame to the cross, and he loves you, and he is with you. And even when you are in the midst of something you know you will regret, if you are joined with him, you are washed, made clean, and all new. Therapist and author Jay Stringer talks about how our sexual addictions and unwanted sexual behavior are often traced to unconscious, unmet needs. He performed a landmark study where he surveyed men and women to see if there was any correlation between the type of unwanted sex they were pursuing, or more concretely, the type of porn categories they were searching for, and see if there was any link between what was going on here and their childhood experiences. To see if it came from any correlation at all between family and childhood wounds. And he found, more often than not, our habitual unwanted sex is connected to family and childhood wounds. That essentially, as adults, we act out our childhood sexual script, but in a sexualized form. And the phrase he says over and over again is this: sexual brokenness reveals our way to healing. Listen, sexual brokenness reveals our way to healing. For too long, the church has looked at addicts and said, you just need to stop. Put the things on your computer, get rid of your phone, behaviorally modify yourselves, and sometimes that can make way for grace, but it hasn't coupled it with the solution of how to move forward. Jay Stringer is arguing that our sexual brokenness actually shows us the very spaces we need healed most, not just in the cessation of it, but he begins to ask the question, when you are angry, confused, when you feel abandoned, why do you return to this thing? What in your story has embedded a message so deep in your soul that this needs to be found this way? See, Jay Stringer is talking about actual freedom. Actual freedom. And he encourages men and women to go to counseling, to dig into their stories and see what drives this and get plugged into their community. No shame, no condemnation, no judging, no hopelessness, just freedom. Friends, I'll close with this. Jesus takes and bears our shame. If you're confused, turn to Jesus. If you're addicted, turn to Jesus. If you bear shame, turn to Jesus. If you're locked in a cycle of abuse, leave and then turn to Jesus. Sex and orgasms point beyond just us here and now and point to the ultimate longing that we have for Jesus to be fully known, for us to be adored and loved and cherished. So my prayer for you is that this would not be just another sex talk where you walk out feeling shame and hopelessness and like you'll never quite get it right. But my genuine prayer is that maybe you'll pursue healing and freedom, some of you for the first time. And some of you believe that whatever habit you have is not actually a long-term habit, and eventually when you get married, you'll kick it. And I can tell you that is not true, because listen, those messages stay in your soul unless you begin to address them. Unless you begin to let the Spirit of God change and move in you in community and with a counselor. So, may we be men and women who see new visions for what sexuality could mean in our culture. May we know what it means to be known and loved by Jesus.